Europe had been at war for less than 3 months, but already hundreds of thousands of young men had died horribly. In the interests of morale and patriotism, the media in each warring nation had portrayed its side as good and the enemy as evil, and what we begin to see is that there was a gap created between what people believed about the war at home and what was actually happening on the front. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. At the beginning of the week, the Russians were crossing the Vistula to try and stop the Germans, who were intent on capturing Warsaw. The Austrians had broken out of the siege at Przemysl, but were badly beaten by the Russians on the River Seine, and the British had just arrived at a sleepy little Belgian town called Ypres. German Army Chief of Staff Falkenhayn had assembled a new army under the Duke of Württemberg to take over the right flank of the German forces in Flanders, which is this part of Belgium and northern France. A lot of the new units were reservists, though, middle-aged men past campaigning, or young recruits that hadn't really been trained, and in their first few days of battle, they would make catastrophic mistakes. Now, the only gap on the Western Front through which either side might possibly make some sort of decisive maneuver was a narrow corridor right here. And that's where the action was happening. On Sunday, October 18th, the British headed eastward from Ypres towards Menin, nearly 20 kilometers away and in German hands. And there were a few skirmishes, but nothing major. The next day, as the advance progressed, British pilots reported huge columns of advancing Germans who would be upon them in hours, so the British withdrew to a low ridge overlooking Ypres. This area would be known as the Ypres salient. Now, a salient in battle is a projection of the line like a bulge, which means that the enemy can attack it on 3 sides. The Ypres salient would be the scene over the next 4 years of some of the bloodiest and harshest battles in all of human history. On the 20th, the Germans attacked along the whole front, 24 divisions against 19, but the main contest this day was at Ypres, where 14 German divisions attacked 7 British, though most of the German forces were Württemberg's reservists. The British were outnumbered in men and artillery, but they were equal to the enemy in machine guns, and they managed to hold their line because of their superiority in rapid rifle fire. Now here we find, as we did at the Battle of the Mons in August, the stories of the Mad Minute. A Mad Minute was, according to the British soldiers of the Great War, the art of hitting 15 targets in 1 minute with a bolt-action rifle, which the British professionals were trained to. And legend has it that at both Mons and the first action at Ypres, German soldiers thought they were facing machine gun fire when in fact it was only intense rifle fire. The German forces made the novice's mistake of advancing in large masses and presented huge targets to the British rifles, suffering terrible casualties. And for the next 3 days, they continued banging their heads against the British lines, attacking by both day and night on a widening front. Looking at it objectively after the fact, these attacks were exercises in futility along the lines of the French attacks we saw at the Battle of the Frontiers in August, with devastating losses for the Germans, and the salient held. Those Germans were volunteers, doing their part for the fatherland, and they had heard for 3 months that the British troops were a joke and would be easily overcome, so they rushed off to die. On the British side, we also see the public failing to understand what was actually happening. British General Smith-Dorrien wrote, quote, "I was struck by the fact that people in England didn't in the least realize the strenuous nature of the fighting at the front, or that we were a long, thin line, without reserves, which might be broken through at any time. Their minds seemed set on what appeared to me a ridiculous fear of an invasion of England," end quote. There was no danger of that at the moment, for it was true stalemate in Belgium and would be for the next 4 years. Further north along the line, the remnants of the Belgian army, now down to around 60,000 men, were holding the coast at Newport, at the mouth of the Ypres River. The Ypres is a narrow river, but it has embankments, and it was a major military obstacle for the Germans. And the Belgians fought valiantly, earning the praise of even their enemy, who were unable to break through. There were, however, breakthroughs on the Eastern Front, where the war had become a war of perpetual motion for the time being. The Russians had been sending troops across their bridgehead on the Vistula River for over a week now, fighting off the Germans who had been trying to take Warsaw. Early on, the Germans had the advantage, but Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff had completely underestimated the size of the enemy, as Russian reinforcements never stopped coming in, being cleverly and secretly well deployed by the Russians. From October 18th to 23rd, the Russian army, after weeks of preparations, began its own attack, even threatening to surround the Germans, who began to retreat on the 20th, realizing that with the mud and the sheer number of opponents, they would not be able to take Warsaw. Further south, the Austrian Chief of Staff Conrad tried again to take on the Russians with his army, this time at Ivangorod. This was not as prudent as the German retreat. On the 22nd, the Austrians attacked, and 4 days later, they were forced to retreat, with 40,000 Austrian casualties. Once again, the Russians would surround Przemysl fortress, garrisoned by 150,000 men, and it would once again be an Austrian island in an ocean of Russian territory. And since I mentioned oceans, we should turn our attention to the Yellow Sea, where the Japanese had the German port of Tsingtao under total blockade. This week, the German torpedo boat S-90 slipped out of the harbor and sank the Japanese cruiser Takachiho with a single torpedo. 271 sailors were drowned. The S-90 was, however, unable to run the blockade and returned to Tsingtao afterwards, and was scuttled by the Germans when she ran low on fuel. There was one very important non-battlefield event that happened this week that really shows the divide between the reality of the battlefield and what the public thought at home. This week saw the signing of the Manifesto of the 93. What this was a proclamation by 93 famous German artists, scholars, and scientists giving their total support to the German cause in the war. In the comments section, you can find a link to read the whole thing yourself. But basically, it says that the signers are responding to the lies of their enemies. They say that it is not true that Germany caused the war, and it is not true that Germany trespassed in neutral Belgium or carried out the reported atrocities there, such as the destruction of Louvain. Everything was done in self-defense. A counter-manifesto, the Manifesto to Europeans, was drafted by the pacifist Professor Nicolai, but gathered only 3 signatures, and one of them had actually also signed the other manifesto. The other 2 who signed were both scientists, Otto Buch from Heidelberg and a scientist from Switzerland named Albert Einstein. So at the end of the week, the Austrians are defeated once again. The Germans are retreating from the Russians. The war is heating up in the Far East, and on the Western Front, huge German offensives are being stopped with devastating losses in men, many of them too young or too untrained to belong in battle. Lloyd George, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer and later Prime Minister, made one of the most legendary speeches of the war on September 19th to address the costs of the war. He said that this war, a war to end all wars, was being fought to free Europe from the rule of a military caste, and that the people of the Allied nations would in the end gain more than they could comprehend in a new moral regeneration and a political rejuvenation and realignment. This was a bill of false goods, because when none of this happened in 1918, the anger and disillusionment of the people was enormous. He could have simply chosen to tell the truth, that the British, French, and Russians had to pay a terrible price in blood to lose the cream of a generation to win a victory that really gave no new advantages, but that this sacrifice must be borne simply to avoid worse things if Germany won the war. After watching our weekly episodes, you might have some questions about certain details or just generally want to know something about us. For exactly these kind of questions, we have a new format called Out of the Trenches, where I give you the answers. You can check them out right here. You can also leave more questions in the comments below on Twitter or on Facebook, and we'll answer them in the future.